everyone, my name is Abby. I was designed using artificial intelligence to be your virtual host for the 6th edition of Lisbon Law and Tech. This international online conference, dedicated to debating the future of law and technology, is organized by the Knowledge Institute of Abreu Advogados. Today, we'll discuss whether digital regulation is a friend or a foe of innovation. The session will be chaired by Luís Barreto Xavier, president of the Knowledge Institute and an off-counsel at Abreu Advogados. Luís is also an invited professor at the Católica Law School in Lisbon, where he teaches the law of artificial intelligence and digital law. Previously, he was the founding dean of the Católica Global School of Law. Welcome, Luís.
Thank you, Abby. I'd like to welcome our distinguished speakers to this session. Bradford is a leading scholar on the EU digital regulatory power. She coined the term Brussels effect to describe the European Union's outsized influence on global markets. She is the author of The Brussels Effect: How the European Union Rules the World. Her newest book, Digital Empires: The Global Battle to Regulate Technology, was recognized as one of the best books of 2023 by the Financial Times and has been translated into Spanish. Anu has earned an LLB and a master's from Helsinki and an LLM and a doctorate from Harvard. She is a professor at Columbia Law School in New York. Arlindo Oliveira is a distinguished professor and former president of Instituto Superior Técnico in Lisbon and the president of INESC. He is also a distinguished guest professor at Macau University of Science and Technology, a researcher of INESC-ID, and a member of the Portuguese Academy of Engineering and of the Lisbon Academy of Sciences. Arlindo studied in Técnico, Berkeley, and INSEAD, and is the author of The Digital Mind: How Science is Redefining Humanity, published by MIT Press, with Portuguese and Chinese translations. He's a well-known AI researcher and an esteemed colleague at the research group of AI and Law of the Católica Research Center for the Future of Law. It is a privilege for the Knowledge Institute of Abreu Advogados to host this session, and I'd like to begin with a question for Anu. Anu, you have written an article where you challenge the commonly accepted notion that strict digital regulation compromises innovation. Can you elaborate on the complexities of this relationship?
So first of all, Luís, thank you so much for having me here today. I am delighted to share this conversation with all of you for the next hour. So the premise of the article is to challenge this, as you say, very commonly thought wisdom that there is a negative relationship between digital regulation and innovation. So the more the government is pursuing digital regulation, the less innovative its tech economy will be. And if you look at some examples, who is leading the tech race? It's really the leading American tech companies. So there is no European Google or Meta or Apple or Amazon or Microsoft. These tech giants all haul from the United States, whereas there are very few leading tech giants that the Europeans have been able to create. So instead, what Europe is known for is its propensity to regulate rather than develop these technologies. So if I ask a room full of people to name a European tech company, it may take them a while, but they are very quick to be able to name the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. So this idea that Americans have all these tech companies, the Europeans don't, yet the Europeans have all the tech regulation, whereas the United States does not have extensive competition law, data privacy law, content moderation, and so forth, just nurtures this presumption that it is because of Europe's commitment to digital regulation, it has not been as successful in leading in the innovation race. So in the article, I challenge this notion. So first of all, I don't claim that all tech regulation is beneficial, but neither is all innovation. But the difference between the US and the EU, the technological gap, the innovation gap that exists, to me is not explained by Europe's propensity to regulate the tech sector and the Americans' unwillingness to do so. Rather, I highlight several other key pillars of the tech ecosystem that explains, in my view, much more compellingly why the Americans have been more successful than the Europeans. So in the article, I talked about the Europeans' inability to have a digital single market that makes scaling much harder for European tech companies, the absence of deep, robust capital markets, so it's harder to fund the innovations in Europe, the European legal frameworks and attitudes towards risk-taking that really make it punitive for entrepreneurs to really engage in disruptive innovations. And I also point to the differences in Americans' ability and the Europeans' inability to harness the global talent that has been fueling many of the innovations that emanate from the US. So the core argument is that we cannot really point to this kind of correlation between digital regulation in Europe and the absence of tech companies, but rather we need to account for these broader policy features, legal features, institutional, cultural features that are sustaining the difference between the US and the EU.
Thank you, Anna. Now a question for you, Arlindo. How do you perceive the balance between regulation and innovation?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and also with Daniel Bradford, which I've heard about her, but never before had the opportunity to meet you. It's an honor. I am not an expert in policy, nor actually in innovation as such, although I've been working in artificial intelligence and machine learning for many years, many decades now. And so my point of view is strictly more technical. So first of all, I had the opportunity to read the interesting article that was sent in advance, written by Anna. Very interesting point, and I mostly agree with the points made in the article that regulation by itself is probably not what is delaying Europe in terms of innovation. I fully agree that there are other causes, and some of them are very well pointed out in the article, that the digital single market is not really a digital single market, is a fractured market. There's also some issues with the capital markets that are much less deep in Europe than in the United States. And then other points in legislation, including this, how bankruptcy is treated, something I was not very familiar with, the comparison between Europe and the United States, but I take it I lived in the United States for many years, and I understand that there are significant differences that, other than regulation, are probably slowing us down. Having said this, I'm not entirely convinced that regulation does not play a role in this. Not by the regulation itself. I think the regulation in general is well-intentioned and is well thought. But then the implementation of the regulation in many cases is very hard. And one of the things is that countries, in the case of directives, countries make implementations of the regulations that sometimes go farther than the original regulation was intended for, and they have significant impacts. For instance, while nobody really can say that GDPR is not useful and regulation and safeguards a number of rights that we are very good that we have. But the fact is that the actual implementation of GDPR, at least in Portugal, where I'm more familiar with, suffers from a number of issues that sometimes make it very hard to make sure that you are actually obeying the GDPR. And what I am afraid is that things like the AI Act, as they become implemented, and the AI Act is particularly difficult to implement in the sense that it's a very high-level risk-based regulation, so a lot will depend on the way it is implemented in actual cases, what sort of warranties do the companies have to make. And my own experience is that probably by not understanding the spirit of the regulation, or by being overcautious on the implementation of the regulation, we may make it more difficult to innovate in Europe than in the United States, or China is a different story. For instance, my own experience, we have been implementing some AI based techniques to help in the assessment of proposals, project proposals, and so on. They are just a tool to help the evaluators. But the fact is that we had to fill so many forms and provide answer so many questions that were really not applicable to this case. And then we had to wait several weeks for that assessment to come back, that in practice we lost about 1 month of work in this particular project, just because people were trying to make sure that we knew what the regulations were, we knew what, and this is a sort of thing that I am a bit afraid, not by the regulation itself, but by the way the regulation is over-implemented in Europe, and certainly in some countries. But other than that, I think there are also positive aspects to regulation. It certainly forces companies and researchers to think of new ways to provide the warranties that I'm thinking more about privacy, but the others are about the same. And I think this can have, in fact, an innovative impact, not only in Europe, but all over the world. And what we see now, for instance, California is also adopting a number of legislation regarding artificial intelligence that, of course, is not the same, and probably anyone knows more about this than I do, is not, of course, the same as it is in Europe, but at least is moving in the right direction of providing some warranties for persons regarding the application. As you know, not all legislation that was proposed in California was approved. So I think the end point is that I think we have to find the right balance between regulating and over-regulating. And I think the challenge will be to find the right point in this balance.
Anu, do you think we are over-regulating, especially when comparing with the United States? You have done huge research that you have described in your book on digital empires, comparing the regulatory approach between the US and European Union, of course with China also regarded, but specifically between the European Union and the US, are we in Europe over-regulating?
Yeah, so first of all, I think Arlindo's remarks are very astute and something we need to take seriously. But if I compare the US and the EU, my concern is not that the Europeans are over-regulating. I'm much more worried about the Americans under-regulating, because I think the Americans have really failed to pursue even the basic protections that are absolutely key to guarantee the fundamental right to privacy or ensure that we can preserve the democratic structures of the society. And even for Europe, I am less worried about the Europeans overdoing it. I'm more worried about the Europeans underdoing it, because I'm worried about the actual implementation. So the Europeans are very good at generating digital regulations, but it's been quite hard often to enforce those laws effectively. So we have a fantastic GDPR, but I don't think anybody can say that we no longer have a problem with data privacy. Our data privacy is being protected. There are many gaps in the enforcement. And one issue where I think the Europeans are potentially over-regulating, if you use the term, is that I share the concern that Arlindo expressed that the GDPR is disproportionately more costly for small and medium-sized companies. The big tech giants can plenty afford to comply with the GDPR. It is the smaller companies, because this is not an asymmetrical regulation. So it applies also to small companies, and there I worry about compliance cost. But let me just, Luís, take a step back and say a few words to introduce the main differences between the American and European approach to digital regulation. So in the Digital Empires book, I distinguish between what I call a market-driven regulatory model that characterizes the US's approach to tech governance, and the European, what I call a rights-driven model. So this American market-driven model is really premised on this idea of maximizing free market, free speech, free internet, incentives to innovate. So the government assumes a very limited role, and the governance of technology is in practice handed over to the tech companies themselves. So it is a techno-libertarian techno-optimacy of the world. And it's reflected in legislation. There is a very weak a mandate, if you like, when it comes to content moderation by tech companies. So Americans are very hesitant to interfere in hate speech or even disinformation because of the fundamental commitment to free speech, and then unwillingness to take the risk that fundamental right would be tampered. So that is a big difference compared to the Europeans, because Europeans are also committed to freedom of expression, but much more sensitive of the harmful effects of hate speech and disinformation. Another example is the difference between regulation of data privacy. There is no federal data privacy law in the United States, which makes the Americans an outlier globally, when the world has largely moved towards regulating this space. Also, then antitrust laws, or what we in Europe say competition laws, up until very recently, when now the US government has started to pursue tech companies, including potentially looking to break up a company like Google. But for the last couple of decades, there has been no meaningful enforcement of antitrust laws in the United States. So these all are very different in Europe, because Europe follows what I call the rights-driven regulatory model. So what's then the basic premise of that European model? So the Europeans are very focused on protecting the fundamental rights of individuals, preserving the democratic structures of the society, and also achieving a fair digital economy, which then includes redistributing power away from the large platforms to smaller companies, to individual users, and to the society at large. So for this reason, the Europeans are much more comfortable in having the government step in and regulate these tech giants so that the harmful effects of their practices can be curtailed. So the Europeans are deploying their competition laws, their data privacy laws, and their laws around content moderation. And now we have the newly adopted AI Act that adds to these legislative initiatives that have been really remarkable and much, much more invasive than any efforts to regulate in the United States.
Thank you, Hanno. I think we will go back we'll come to discuss a bit the AI Act later, but I'd like to now ask Arlindo to consider the regulatory developments in Asia and what's been happening with their approaches to technology and innovation. I know you have been teaching in Macau and you have experience also in other parts of Asia. So Arlindo, what can you tell me or tell us on these developments, and especially
yes, so
in China?
I'm not an expert in Asian legislation or Chinese legislation, but I have my direct experience with working in projects there. And if we leave aside Japan for a while, Japan is a little bit different. But if we think about mostly China and related countries where China is the big player there, I mean, the approach is very different, right? I mean, it's very different. While, as Anu was saying, Europe has a strong focus on individual rights and also on the freedom of speech. Those are two considerations that I venture to say that are not primary concerns of Chinese government, right? I mean, they have other primary concerns that are also relevant and are also especially relevant in Asia and in countries where poverty is so. I mean, they focus a lot on development, they focus a lot on opportunities, they focus a lot on developing technology and making the country competitive internationally. Those are important concerns of the Chinese government. Of course, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Chinese government, but this is the feeling I have. And the interesting thing is that we may think this is just a position of the Chinese government, and the population is concerned with these things, but the Chinese government is not. But that will be an oversimplification. Certainly, there are concerns about freedom of speech and individual rights in China. But overall, and when I say overall, I speak with people I work with researchers, with people from companies and so on. Overall, people are very much aligned with these concerns. I mean, but they are worried about development, they are worrying about progress, they are worried about the technology, Chinese technology in particular, being dominant. So we are looking at a continent, or at least at a country, that has very different concerns very different from Europe and also very different from the United States. So we have three very different approaches: the under-regulation and the almost total focus on free speech that you see in the United States. What I believe is somewhat of a balanced view in Europe, where you also have concerns with free speech, but you also are concerned with the negative effects of free speech led to its ultimate consequences. And then China, where free speech is certainly not the major issue there, right? They are worried about safety, they are worried about security, but free speech, I venture to say, is certainly not there. And this, of course, leads to very different environments for development, right? The United States, with its, let's call it under-regulation, I agree, of course, leaves this opportunity for companies to try many things that in Europe, for instance, will be harder to try. Probably some of them should not have been tried, right? I mean, we agree on that. And China, for a totally different reason, right? That individual rights and are not that big of a concern. They also can experiment a lot, right? So in that respect, and for very almost opposite reasons, it's easier to experiment in China and it's easier to experiment in the United States, maybe experimenting things that should not be experienced, right? Should not be experimented. Like China, I mean, they use face recognition and they use social scoring, which are things that I think we all agree that will never fly in Europe, and more than that, I mean, will be seen as a violation of basic rights. While in China, they view this with, I mean, not all Chinese, of course, but most Chinese view this with some normality and as a fact of life. So I think these three different approaches to not only to regulation, but what should be the priorities that guide technological development. I think these very different approaches in the three big blocks, I think they create a particularly difficult field to get innovation going in the right direction in all of them. What we'll see, I think, will be different vectors of innovation. Hopefully, Europe, which I believe is somewhat in the middle, at least in some dimensions, will be able to influence somewhat the United States, somewhat China, and what to develop. But I think to do this, we also have to keep the dialogue at the borders open. And what I'm worried now is that is not happening, right? I mean, we are basically closing the borders or trying to close the borders, if not physically, at least from an innovation standpoint, right? It's harder to work with Chinese colleagues, especially if you have cooperation with American universities. There's a lot of pressure for high tech, whatever that means, not being shared with Chinese colleagues. So I think that keeping the scientific borders open would be a better way to try to make sure that these different standards, these different approaches somewhat converge, which is something that I don't see now, right? Especially with China, but also between Europe and the United States. Then there is the thing that both in the United States and Europe, they are not a single block, right? I mean, there are different approaches within the United States, because the federal government has not been legislating a lot on this. So some states are going forward. California is the most notorious one. And the same will probably happen in Europe somewhat, although in Europe there is more desire for a centralized view. So anyway, and with a short answer to your question is, I think we can view Chinese legislation as non-existent from the point of view of the worries that we Europeans are concerned. From all practical purposes, Chinese, in particular Chinese, but other Asian companies can do pretty much all sorts of experiments that will probably not fly in Europe because the regulation, it exists, but it has very different concerns, very different priorities.
Thank you, Arlindo. I'd like now to ask an opposite question. So how regulation can foster innovation? Anu, I think you have discussed this in your writings. Is that so? Can regulation really foster and create opportunities for companies to innovate, to create new services, new products, and develop?
Absolutely. So in many ways, regulation can change the pathways for innovation. So it can direct the companies away from certain type of innovation that the governments consider undesirable or harmful towards the kind of innovations that have greater social benefit. So one example, if we think about data privacy, is that the data privacy regulation, yes, it will hamper certain kind of innovation. It makes surveillance capitalism harder. There are limits to how the companies can use very invasive techniques to exploit the data that they harness for commercial purposes. But it also can create more kind of privacy enhancing innovations that can create more value for consumers who value privacy. So if you think about then the GDPR pushing the companies towards developing products and services that are more conscious of an individual right to privacy, in many ways that can be valuable as a social innovation. It means that it leads to innovations that guarantee the digital rights of individuals. But it can also lead to market innovations, meaning that companies can also often monetize such benefit. So if you think about a company like Apple, Apple has really made privacy its trademark. It's very proud of its commitment to protecting the user's data. And if you think about some moments, for instance, when Apple decided that it's going to ask all the users of iPhones, there's a notice that pops up that is asking the user to choose whether it wants the app on the Apple iPhone to track an individual. So including Facebook being able to track your movements online, making very easy for consumers to choose no, which many of them did, many of us did. And that was a major blow on Meta, but that has really benefited Apple by making privacy just one of the core values of the company that is really exhibited in the products of the company. That said, Apple has different rules when it operates in China, and we can have a different conversation of whether it is really willing to uphold that value globally. But I think it's a good example that there are companies that are seeing the GDPR push them towards the kinds of choices that is a commercial advantage for them. The same way, if you think about AI regulation, the users are legitimately worried about the harms associated with AI. And they need to trust the AI applications to really be able to use those applications safely. So the market uptake of AI products and services is going to be higher if we can get consumer trust to an elevated level. And regulation can do that. If the consumers know that the companies need to adhere to regulations that put in place certain safety metrics, it can also then convert into a commercial advantage. So those are just a couple of examples, Luís, how regulation can help innovation. The same way that if the competition laws are sort of breaking the monopolies of big companies, making it easier for smaller companies to enter market, that enhances the diversity of innovation. So different types of products that are going to be available for consumers. So those are some examples I may leave you with, recognizing though that it's not that every digital regulation is beneficial for innovation, but let me go back to repeating, neither is all kind of innovation that we see beneficial absent regulation.
Thank you, Anu. Now I think a question for both of you. And I'm thinking of the AI Act, but also of other digital regulations. And I see a burden, especially on small and medium enterprises and startups. And the cost of compliance is high for those companies. And the level of regulation that European Union is developing may be really too high for them to strive. How do you see this and also the way the AI Act deals with it, with regulatory sandboxes and other measures protecting those companies? Do you think they are sufficient for those companies to be successful?
Do you want me to take this, or Arlindo, do you want to go first? Why don't you go first?
Sure. So, well, first, a very marginal side note, which is I really don't like very much the name Artificial Intelligence Act. I'd rather have the Artificial Intelligence Applications Act. But this is just a detail, of course, because I don't think regulating the technology is such a good idea. I think what we should regulate is the applications of the technology. Of course, that's what the AI Act does, right? So this is just a minor detail on the name. I mean, we are not discussing them. So regarding the AI Act, I think the impacts on innovation, I think, is one positive and one negative from what I see in Portugal. So the positive effect, of course, is that companies are worried about the AI Act. So they are trying to learn rapidly what are their responsibilities, not only regarding new technologies that they want to use and to implement, but also regarding technology that may already have running or implementing on data they have and so on. So this is the good part, right? Companies know that they have to do the right thing. There are fines and there are other measures if you don't comply. So I think, and we have been getting a large number of requests here in our research institute from companies that want support. They want both legal support, as you probably know, and they also want technical support in what they can do, what they cannot do, and so on. I think this is very positive because this is making the companies more knowledgeable and, to be fair, also more competitive, because a company that follows these rules probably is more competitive internationally in the sense that it will not run into roadblocks in the future and so on. The negative part is that in some cases, especially for the smaller companies, they are too scared, right? I mean, the AI Act is a complex thing. I mean, the legislation itself is rather complex, but the implementation is particularly complex, right? What sort of warranties can you give when you put an LLM serving as a chatbot? I mean, nobody really in today's state of the technology can provide more than reasonable warranties that the chatbot will not, do something that it should not do, right? And this is really hard technologically. This is not just a problem that will go away very easily. So this fear of the companies that they may get into legal issues if they do the wrong thing can actually slow down the adoption of this technology. And this worries me a little bit, maybe more in Portugal than other countries, to be fair, because in Portugal we suffer from a chronic low productivity issue, right? Portugal is the countries in Europe, one of the ones where productivity is lower, right? And we should strive to achieve higher productivity, and I really believe that AI technology can play a significant role in that. We also have some issues with qualified people that AI can also help, but productivity is really my major issue. So if we delay the adoption of AI technologies by 1 year, by 2 years, until the companies are sure that the technology does not cause problems and so on, we may actually be delaying significant improvements in productivity and in competitiveness of Portugal. And this is the negative part. What can we do about this? Well, of course, you can advise, right? I mean, you can advise from a legal standpoint, you can advise from a technical standpoint, but you may, as you probably believe me when I say that if you are a small or a medium-sized company and you have doubts about the legal risks that you are incurring by adopting, I don't know, whatever AI technology in your products or in your services on your website, you will probably delay the adoption of that. So I'm a bit afraid that by a lack of knowledge and by fear, companies will delay the implementation of some technologies that whose risk is relatively low, I think. But the fear is a little bit overblown. Regulatory sandboxes, I think they are an important the disposition of the act. I think they can be useful. In that respect, I think Portugal is interesting as a place where you can run experiments. We have sort of the right dimension. We are early adopters of technology. So I think the idea of sandboxes can be used to our benefit in several respects, but will not exactly solve the problem. And we are talking about slightly different companies. If you are a startup that wants to use the technology, maybe you can use the idea of a sandbox. If you are a somewhat established company where you just want to improve your business model and so on, then you may be more conservative and not adopt as easily, as quickly, if you are afraid of the legal issues that will come from adopting such a technology. So this is my take on that.
Very well. Anu?
Yeah, no, those were extremely insightful remarks. So maybe just add something to contrast the concerns that I expressed around the GDPR being disproportionately more expensive in terms of the compliance cost felt by small and medium-sized companies. The newest set of regulations, including then the DSA and DMA, so the Digital Service Act, dealing with content moderation, accountability and transparency there, and then DMA, the Digital Markets Act, which is an ex-ante regulation, competition regulation of the digital gatekeepers. Those are asymmetrical regulations by design. So the DMA only applies to the largest tech companies that meet certain thresholds. So there we don't have the same problem that we are targeting with the companies that don't have the ability to bear those compliance costs. So there the philosophy is that the biggest companies are the biggest problem if we think about abuses of market power, and they have the great resources to comply. So I am sympathetic to this kind of more targeted regulation. Of course, one can have conversation, are the thresholds at the right level? How many companies ought to be caught by these regulations? The DSA is a little bit of both. So it doesn't only apply to the largest companies, it applies to smaller ones as well. But then it imposes additional, more burdensome obligations to the companies that basically are capable of generating systemic risks, that are very large online platforms or very large search engine. So that also reflects the idea that the harms are different, the compliance ability and compliance cost and expectations are different. And even with the AI Act, we have additional obligations for generative AI in case of the particular types of generative AI that can cause greater systemic risks. So the most powerful models will then need to meet additional requirements. So that's, I think, one way how the regulation can adjust and adapt to the reality whereby we treat the small and the larger companies differently. And that can, in my view, generally have beneficial effects on innovation.
Yeah, thank you. And Anu, you have been mentioning these key factors that in Europe are not helping to develop innovation, such as market integration, which is really not done. The digital internal market is not complete, of course. We don't have really integrated capital markets. We don't have the same cultural attitude towards risk as there is in the United States. What can actually Europe do to tackle this lack of factors that can foster innovation?
Yeah, so there my policy prescription, if you like, is for the Europeans not to retreat from regulating the digital rights and having regulations like the DSA and DMA and GDPR and the AI Act. But rather, the Europeans shouldn't content themselves just to be the regulators. They also need to make sure that they are the innovators. They develop technologies. So you need to create the conditions for the tech companies to thrive and innovate. And that then requires then closing that technological gap with the US by focusing on sort of 4 areas that I have identified as an urgent priority for the Europeans. So one is, as we recognize, the Europeans really need to complete the digital single market. There are still many barriers that make it difficult for European tech companies to scale. So obviously there are different languages. We cannot fully sort of address that difficulty. There are different cultural expectations. So people in Portugal and Slovenia watch different movies more than the users, the consumers in Michigan and the state of Virginia. But then there are also legal differences, regulatory differences that really need to be removed, where we need more harmonization so that the companies don't need to develop different product varieties for different markets, so meet different warranty obligations that an individual member states, for instance, puts out there. So in addition to completing the digital single market, the Europeans would really need to complete the capital markets union and make sure that we have robust, deep, vibrant European-wide capital markets. Currently, you are a tech startup in Lisbon, and you are not raising money across the entire European capital markets. You often rely on Portuguese banks, and that's just not sustainable. That has nothing to do with the vibrancy of the American model, which really has excellent, deep, well-functioning venture capital market. Then the third issue is the risk-taking. So if you think about the bankruptcy laws in the United States and Europe, there are very big differences. In Europe, the bankruptcy laws are punitive. If you are an entrepreneur, you start a business and you are unsuccessful and you go down, you are done. You don't have a second chance. Whereas in the United States, the bankruptcy laws are much more lenient and they are much more merciful, if you like. But so are the cultural attitudes. In Europe, there's this stigma associated with failure, whereas in Silicon Valley, it's built into baked into the venture capital model. You go out there, you start a business. If you lose and if you fail, you go and raise more money, and they give you more money because it seems like you're working on big things. So that is just important for the entrepreneurs to really be able to pursue disruptive, risky innovations. And let me mention the fourth issue, Luís, that I think is extremely important. You cannot be a top innovation continent unless you have access to the top innovators. And Americans have been spectacularly successful in harnessing the globally best talent that come to the United States and innovate and benefit the American innovation ecosystem and the labor market. The Europeans have not had such a successful proactive plan around immigration. So if you look at over $1 billion startups in the United States, over 50% of those have an immigrant founder. And if we look at even the biggest tech companies, the household names and their founders, just think about this. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, second-generation Cuban. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, South African. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, Brazilian. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, Russian. So again, this is not the story of the Europeans having this digital regulation. No, the bigger story is that the Europeans have not been able to harness the global talent to come and innovate in Europe. So really the main point of my writing has been to invite the Europeans to think about what they can do to encourage immigration, rewrite the bankruptcy laws, build the digital single market, and finally get the deep capital markets union off and running.
Thank you, Anu. Arlindo, what's your take on that from the research point of view, also from companies' point of view, and how can policymakers help build this agenda? And on the other side, should innovation be funded above all by private funding, or should governments and public funding be in place, in your opinion?
So first of all, I fully agree with all the points that Anu raised. I think they're all very good points. I was going to make the point about human resources myself. I think this is probably really the most critical factor in innovation, is having the right people. And we have many good people in Europe, but not as many as the United States. So this is for sure. And within Europe, there are asymmetries that are also relevant. I mean, it's not as easy to get the best people in Southern Europe as it is in Northern Europe, because the salaries are different. So it's very hard to get someone who earns, I don't know, $100,000 or so to come to Portugal, because the salary probably be below that, well below that, even if you are highly capable engineer or researcher. So I think the human resource is an issue. There is not an easy solution, I think. It will be interesting to understand exactly, of course, the MITs and the Caltechs and Berkeleys and CMUs and Harvards of the United States are big names, but we also have top schools in Europe, Imperial College and EPFL and so on. So there is a difference there, and if you look at the budget of these institutions, you'll see there is a big difference, right? I mean, the budget of one of these big institutions like Stanford is several times larger than the overall budget of R&D and education in Portugal. So we are talking about a big difference in sizes. But I still think we could do better. I think we could do better. Maybe we are making immigration too hard. Maybe we are not giving the right stimulus. So it's not my specialty, but I definitely think we should do a better job here. The other thing that Anu she made a reference to it several times in the paper, in the articles, but I don't think she made now is, and this is also very hard to overcome, which is we are not a unique market for different things because regulations vary. That is an important thing, but the language is also a barrier, right? Many things that involve AI involve language in some way, and it's a totally different thing to release something in English and have a market of 300 million people, or release something in French or in German or so on, where your market is a fraction of that. Not to speak of Portuguese or some language less spoken in Europe. AI actually raises the possibility that you can overcome this in some cases, right? Because automated translation, and very soon automated translation in real time will be soon available. This will help in some cases. In other cases, it doesn't, right? For instance, a legal tech, right? It's much easier to create a startup that is a legal tech in the United States than in Europe, because in Europe, you'll be faced with 27 different regulations, 27 different sets of laws, and so on. Of course, in the United States, not everything is the same in the 50 states, but still is very different. So I think these two factors, the human resources and the fragmentation of legislation and language in Europe they are I think the very, very big roadblocks for development. There is not a lot we can do about the second one, I think, really, not in the short term. I think we could do something about the first one. Then the other thing, I think capital is an issue, but to be fair, I don't see companies limited at the startup phase by capital, even in Portugal. I can see them limited once they get to the second stage. They need a Series A, or they need to grow. There is very different. The markets, the capital markets are not so deep, and many of them actually go out. So we have I think 7 unicorns in Portugal, which is a reasonable number for a country of this size. But I think most of them, at least 5 of them, now move to the United States. I mean, they started here and they still have offices here and facilities here, but they moved to the United States. So as you grow, it's hard to stay in a small country in Europe. Probably not as hard in Germany or so on, but still harder. So, but I think those are I think the capital markets are an issue, but really my major worry is with the human capital, the human resources, and the fragmentation of legislation and language. Not much we can do about language in Europe.
Thank you, Arlindo. Now we are approaching to the end of our session, but I'd like to ask you, Anu, regarding the AI Act. Do you foresee a Brussels effect of this regulation? And for you, how important is it to have a global harmonization of standards of some sort in the AI sphere?
Yeah. So it's a difficult question, because I think Arlindo can really explain to us how AI is a multifaceted thing. So there are different applications of AI, and I don't think there will be a kind of a single answer to whether there will be a Brussels effect with respect to the different dimensions of how AI is regulated and how it's applied in different settings. But I do think that there are some reasons to expect that the European AI Act will shape the markets outside of Europe. So let me just give you a couple of examples. One is that there's now the kind of really global momentum to regulate, and many governments around the world are looking for best ways to regulate AI. So they can use the AI as a template, because it is the world's first comprehensive binding AI regulation. So any government that is looking, and we already have examples of that, are now looking what are the models out there. And the Europeans are known as an experienced regulator. They generated regulations like the GDPR that have been replicated, emulated by governments around the world. So we are likely to see a de jure Brussels effect through other governments, maybe not copying everything, but adopting, for instance, the kind of European risk-based assessment that there are different tiers of regulating AI, the high risk, the unacceptable risk, and so forth. So we probably see some degree of emulation. And the other one is that we probably see the tech companies that are now adjusting their product development to comply with the European AI Act, that some of those changes they are going to make across the board. And the same goes with other users of AI technology. So imagine you are a global bank that is using AI to determine how to allocate credit. So to basically assess the credit worthiness of an individual. Under the AI Act, that is considered a high risk activity. And you need to then have sort of higher requirements to make sure you have unbiased data sets. And how do you basically manage the data when you train your algorithms? And there, if the company then complies with the EU's AI Act and manages to come up with the kind of AI system to measure creditworthiness that is more robust, that is more accurate, that is less discriminatory, it's very unlikely that they would then not use that same AI system in other markets, that they would basically have riskier, less accurate, less high quality systems elsewhere. The same thing if you are a company and your human resources department is using AI to screen potential job applicants. And under the EU's AI Act, there are many sort of requirements on making sure that your hiring algorithms are not biased. Again, I wouldn't expect then that compliance be limited to the European Union when the company has already made the investments that enhance the quality of the AI systems. So there will be some examples where the companies are already making the investments in the EU, decide voluntarily to extend it to other markets, but also for preemptive reasons, because they expect the other regulators to come after them soon with their own regulations. So they are also anticipating more regulatory pushback unless they can show that, look, we are already moving towards regulating under the AI Act, but not limiting our compliance to Europe.
Thank you, Anu. I'd like to ask now Arlindo another question on the existential risks that some thinkers are highlighting. I think of Harari, for instance, or even Hinton, who has just won the Nobel Prize. Should the regulator worry about existential risks of artificial intelligence?
This is a very challenging question, right? Very easy to get wrong, I think. So, so I can give you my own take, but with the safeguard that the proviso that I may be wrong. So the most common understanding in the AI community is that the sort of existential risks that Hinton is referring to, has been referring to, or Harari and others, are probably overblown given the current state of the technology. So this is probably, I don't know, 80, 90% of the community will support this position. Then there is, I don't have statistics on this, but let's say 20% of the community that may align with Geoffrey Hinton and others, saying that maybe this is not such a far-fetched idea and maybe we should start thinking about it. So all this to say that even people that have been thinking about this and are very familiar with the technology and know exactly what the technology can do now and in a few years, even people, for instance, the 3 Turing Awards, so Hinton won the Nobel, but 3 of them won the Turing Award a couple of years ago, and they are very divided on this, right? So, I think the community is deeply divided on a difficult question, and the difficult question is: are risks of AI becoming rogue in some way, and creating a risk for humanity in some way? Are these risks imaginary or are real? Right? So, as I said, I am actually somewhere in the middle. I don't think they are totally imaginary. I think there is a reasonable there is a reasonable chance that we will develop in the next couple of decades or so systems that are powerful enough and have enough agency to become risky by themselves in some way, either by controlling energy systems or by controlling transportation systems, or I'm assuming no weapon systems will use this so soon and so on. So the question was not whether the existential risks are real or imaginary. The question was whether regulation can be used to avoid these risks if they are real. I guess that's the question, right? And my answer to that is mostly negative, because I think we don't have enough coordination at the world, at the global level, to use this. So imagine that, I don't know, 10 years from now, we have very powerful systems. We have systems that have agency, maybe even they have conscience or some sort of characteristic that makes them risky, in the sense that they can make their own decisions and some of these decisions may not be good for us. So imagine this. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but imagine this. Do you think that the United States, Europe, China, and possibly other countries like India, Japan, and so on, will get together to craft some regulation that will keep these risks bounded, that will keep these systems within limits? I don't see, looking at the world today, how this could happen. Maybe we could do it in Europe. Maybe we could do it in the United States with the right push. Maybe the United Nations can provide some guidelines. But I mean, what will stop China or Iran, or I mean, this technology, it can very easily be developed by countries that are not the most powerful countries in the world. So the answer to your question, can regulation address this issue? My take is mostly negative, which is not to say that I believe that regulation should not address this issue. I just believe that I don't see how it could be effective. And I guess I have to answer the follow-up question, which is, so what can be effective in addressing those risks? And I think the only thing that can be effective in addressing those risks, and even so with a lot of provisos, is if the scientific community is open about this, if all developments or most developments are made are open, we have open source and so on, and the scientific community can assess the risks, analyze the risks, and somehow regulate itself by not developing these technologies. I don't think top-down technology from a specific or a number of specific economic blocks can address these issues. Having said all this, we are still talking about very hypothetical things, right? I don't know whether such a technology will exist in 10 or 20 years. Maybe it will never exist. Maybe we'll never develop it. But I will not put my money on that. I think sooner or later, maybe not in 10 years, but in a few decades, we will have the technology that can become dangerous in a way, and we'll have to decide as a whole, as the world together, what to do with that technology. And many of those impacts will be positive, but others will be risky and potentially very dangerous.
So thank you, Arlindo. And Anu, do you want to comment on this? Do you have an insight on this?
I think, well, this was really, really astute, but let me maybe try to end on a more positive note, which is that even at the height of the Cold War between the Soviets and the United States, there were arms control treaties. So I think for some of these technologies that, even though I share the pessimism that we will not have an international AI treaty, we will not be able to globally govern this technology, especially in today's heightened sort of the geopolitically tense environment. There could be some of those, including the autonomous weapons, how we can do what we can do to move towards collectively restraining the use of some of those technologies, really kind of thinking about what was possible during the Cold War. I also think that any attempts to try to come into international consensus, we need to kind of distinguish between sort of protecting rights and then protecting ourselves against some of the risks. And we are never going to have a global consensus on whether we use facial recognition for mass surveillance. I mean, the Chinese and the Europeans and the Americans just do not see that in the same way. But there are certain issues where the Chinese and the Americans and Europeans can sit down and say, look, for instance, we don't want these technologies to be obtained by bad actors. There are certain risks that are risks to humanity. We don't need to politicize that. So the more we can kind of depoliticize the conversation around existential risks and thinking about that in terms of the common risk to the entire humanity, I think there's some optimism that we could make at least limited progress. But I think where I do share the concern too, that there is a possibility that kind of non-state actors, rogue actors, get access to the technology. They don't respect international treaties, and they will be harder to deter. So it's not that we can, by law and treaties and negotiations and diplomacy, deter all the potential risks, but there's still something that we can do to make the world safer. And the more we can think about that as a question of science and question about kind of global stability and security and the benefit of humanity, which is not the question of ideology, those aspects, so the risk aspect, to some extent, I think I'm more optimistic that something can be done globally.
So thank you, Anu. Thank you, Arlindo. I think it was an excellent session. But we have now to close it, and I hope everyone enjoyed this session, and I invite you to join us for tomorrow's session again. So I'd like to call Abby to close the session now.
Thank you.
We have reached the end of today's session. I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to our speakers for sharing their time and insights with us. We would love to have your feedback too. Please fill out a short survey using the QR code shown on the screen. We invite you to join us tomorrow for the discussion of the foundations of a new economy, digital assets, digital euro, digital wallets.